This is our Simondon reading group meeting possibly for the last time on this book, depending on how far we get today. We are picking up from page 182 of the translation, so just before the conclusion. So we're on part 4, still on the last section of this part about technical invention. So I mentioned in the last couple of sessions, I think I've mentioned that this whole part of the book of the lectures is closely connected to Simondon's other main book that we read a couple years ago now, on the mode of existence of technical objects. So in that book, there's a few different projects that he's engaged in that book. And so the first part of that book, he's looking at what it is for there to be a lineage of technical objects. So what is it about a technical object that makes it a descendant of some other technical object? And his answer to that question is in terms of concretization. So just to sort of quickly summarize, a technical object is more concrete than another technical object insofar as the more concrete technical object has a greater integration of functions among its components. So in an abstract technical object, each component contributes just one function to the functioning of the whole object, whereas in a more concrete one, all the different effects of the different components on each other are all integrated into the functioning of the object. And so what this means in particular for in relation to individuation, which is sort of Simondon's key concept, is that an abstract technical object tends to destroy itself through its functioning. So you have the one function that a component contributes to the functioning of the whole, but then you also have all sorts of side effects that are undesired. You have noise, friction, wear of gears against each other, things like that. All these other effects sort of tend to destroy the functioning of the entire technical object. Whereas in a more concrete technical object, all the different effects are incorporated, or as many effects as possible are incorporated into the functioning of the technical object. And so that means that you have fewer side effects and less of a self-destructive nature of the object. So this is a kind of individuation because the entity now sort of persists in being in a way that it didn't before, or its operation, or what it does has a sort of self-reinforcing nature that it didn't have before. So that's just sort of a quick overview of this concept of concretization, which is kind of in the background in this discussion. He doesn't, I don't think, explicitly give us a presentation of what concretization is, but it's always sort of in mind in this last bit that we've read. So he's looked at, he's given us a few different examples of technical objects, and we don't need to go through all of them again, but one thing that he sort of makes clear in this bit is the contrast between sort of intrinsic technical development, so this process of concretization, and then more extrinsic operations that affect the development of technical objects. So you can think here, an example that he uses on the mode of existence of technical objects is the development of cars. So if you just sort of take the core functioning of a car, it's just a motor that makes wheels turn, and then a chassis and a cabin for the driver and passengers, and any objects they're transporting, etc. This is sort of like the pure schema of a car, and then you can have technical developments that make this pure schema more concrete, or technically better in various ways. You can have a more powerful engine, for example, a more efficient engine in terms of fuel efficiency, things like that. But if you look at the historical evolution of cars, there's all kinds of other things that are sort of accessory to this that are largely designed to make the car more either more comfortable for the passengers and driver, or that have this sort of semiotic nature or semiotic intention. So he talks about power steering, for example. He argues that in most cars, power steering, or at least in the cars of his era, power steering is not really necessary for the functioning of a car, because the physical force of the driver is sufficient for turning the wheel and transmitting that force to the wheels of the car. So there's no sort of intrinsic necessity to incorporate power steering into the functioning of a car, but power steering, what it signifies is like a kind of luxury or like sophistication, and sort of retroactively makes the car with manual steering seem sort of old-fashioned or like unsophisticated. And so all these sorts of electronics, added on to the car's sort of basic functioning had this semiotic role of conveying, sophistication or high tech or something along those lines, and as opposed to, sort of contributing to the basic functioning of the car. And an example that he gives in this book that we saw is these cars in the 50s that had these aluminum dashboards. And so this is sort of the way Simon Noll describes it is it's borrowed from airplane design, where the actual weight of the interior of the plane is important. So minimizing the weight using light metals that have high structural integrity is important. Whereas in a car, the difference in weight between like an aluminum dashboard and wood or some sort of plastic or whatever is minimal. It doesn't really affect the actual functioning of the car, but the aluminum has this semiotic function of conveying, this car is like similar to an airplane. It's very high tech and modern and so on. So yeah, there's this accessory function of conveying something about the owner of a technical object that is sort of added on to the intrinsic technical development of the object. So that's what he's been talking about the last couple of bits that we've looked at, and then he talks about the way that some of these sort of the relationship between the user and the technical object, how it can affect the diffusion of the technical object. So he talks about tractors in France, for example, the way that in the early years of the 20th century, tractors were not really taken up very much in France compared to the US. And some people had sort of attributed this to like peasant mentality, that peasants are conservative and afraid of change and they don't understand technical objects and so on. But then later in sort of the post-World War II era, there start to develop the new tractors that have more flexibility of function. They allow for a variety of different functions to all be incorporated in one technical object. And these tractors are taken up by peasants or small farmers in France. And so Simon Noll argues that the obstacle to the diffusion of tractors in France wasn't anything about like peasant mentality or conservatism or whatever. It was just the fact that farms in the US are much more likely to be big, flat, square farms, as opposed to in France, you have like a variety, you have small farms with a variety of different crops. And so instead of like a giant wheat field or a cornfield or whatever, where you just drive your tractor back and forth, doing the same thing for hours on end, you have to have a tractor that is flexible, that can switch between different tasks. And once the technical object was adapted to the requirements of those users, they did adopt it. So you can look at the development of technical objects in relation to the needs of the users in that sense, and then also like the more intrinsic development of the technical object in terms of that concretization process. So these are sort of parallel developments, but also they sort of relate to each other reciprocally because, like for example, in the case of the tractor, you have to have an engine that's sufficiently powerful to perform all these different functions, but also light enough to fit on a tractor and, not weigh down the whole machine. So like these two forms of evolution are sort of related to each other as well. And then the last bit the bit that we're on now is looking at he calls this other categories of created objects. And so he's thinking in particular of aesthetic objects. And this is similar in some ways to the creation of technical objects in that when you create an artwork, a painting or a piece of music or whatever, you're inventing something, you're creating something new, you're bringing about the individuation of something that didn't exist before you perform this act of creation. but at the same time, it's different in that there's much less in the way of sort of incorporation into the capacities that exist in the world in the way that a technical object is. So in a technical object, you have to you have creativity in inventing a technical object, but you can only be creative within the limits of what kinds of physical forces are available to you and materials and so on. So you have to take these given forces and materials and then combine them and use them in creative ways. Whereas in the creation of an artwork, you have, in some sense, more freedom. You're still using, like, paint is a physical substance that is produced out of minerals and plants and so on. But you have a certain freedom in terms of how you want to arrange those colors on a canvas, or musical instruments again are physical objects that have physical properties that limit what types of sounds they can make, but at the same time you have freedom in terms of how you want to arrange those musical notes to produce sort of musical creations. And then in sort of parallel to just a sec. Oh, we lost someone. Oh well. Yeah, so in parallel to this sort of distinction between the intrinsic and extrinsic development of technical objects, you can also look at this kind of extrinsic use of aesthetics. So one of his examples that he gives is this use of opticalization, so like high vis sort of decorations added to objects to make them sort of stand out. And for Simondon, this is a kind of excrescence on an object. The aesthetic decoration of this optical tape, for example, is not related to the actual structure. So there's like sort of an external relationship between the object itself and this decoration. And another example of this that Simondon doesn't talk about, but I think possibly in Individuation he might have mentioned this, but is like the sort of Baroque style of decoration, where you have all these like flowers and curlicues and stuff applied to mantelpieces and columns and things like that. So like you have sort of the basic form of the object, and then you just sort of apply flowers like kind of randomly to the shape to make it more beautiful, or supposedly more beautiful. And so again, there's a sort of extrinsic relationship between the actual shape of the object and then this sort of external decoration that's applied to it. And for Simondon, this is kind of not really creating an art object in the proper sense of the term. It's just sort of it's a kind of extrinsic relationship between the decoration and the object itself. And so when you think of like a real artistic creation, there's an intrinsic relationship between the form of the object, whether it's a painting or a musical structure or whatever it is, and then any sort of decoration is like integrated into that form in a much more in a much closer sense than just applying optical tape to the side of a car or whatever. Okay, so I think that's more or less where we got to last time. So let's pick up from the. Oh, sorry, we're at 182. Yeah, so let's pick up from the top of 182. If someone else would like to read,
I can read. Okay, 182. From the top?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, right from the top.
Okay. Any inventor in the realm of art is futuristic to some extent, which means that he exceeds the hic nunc of needs and ends by enlisting within the created object sources of those effects that live and multiply in the work. The creator is sensitive to the virtual, to what calls forth from the depths of time, and with a humility situated in a distant place. The course of the future and the amplitude of the world is a place of manifestation. The creator saves the phenomena because he is sensitive to what, in each phenomenon, calls for amplifying manifestation, the sign of an enjambment pointing toward the future. He is the person in whom the genesis of images reveals the desire of beings to exist, or rather to exist a second time by being born again in a meaningful universe, where each local reality communicates with the universal, and where, rather than being buried in the past, each instant remains the origin of an echo that multiplies and becomes more nuanced as it diversifies.
Actually, let's stop here. Sorry. Uh, yeah, this is a pretty important paragraph and pretty dense. So yeah, let's stop here and discuss this before we go on to the next one.
That sounds good.
Yeah. So a couple of points on this part is so there's this phrase "save the phenomena," which, if you remember, he used already in the introduction of the lecture course. And he describes the whole project of this course as a phenomenology in the sense of saving the phenomena. And this is a phrase from Plato. And in Plato, I forget actually which dialogue it comes from, but it may be the Timaeus, but I'm not sure. Anyway, he uses this phrase to describe astronomical model building, I guess you could say in modern terms. So the idea is that as an observer, an observing astronomer, you look at the movement of the stars in the heavens, and then you build your model of the movement of these stars in such a way that you reproduce the observed movements of the stars in the heavens. So, like in a Ptolemaic system, you have circular orbits around the Earth, and then epicycles that account for the retrograde movement of planets. And this of course has sort of been like denigrated in later development. Epicycles are the word epicycle is used as a sort of criticism of a theory, is saying that it just sort of applies these arbitrary hypotheses to accommodate the predictions. But this was of course a pretty sophisticated intellectual enterprise of mathematical modeling at the time. Postulating these circular motions of different celestial bodies to account for the observed movement. And Simondon was using this phrase "save the phenomena" in a somewhat different sense, but I think it's connected. But it's the idea of putting images back into their development and genesis. So we've throughout the whole book, we've been looking at this cycle of the image that he presents. So the image prior to the object. So this is sort of the anticipation of an object, and then the image in perception. So the present phase of the image, and then the image in recollection or memory after the encounter with the object, and then finally invention that sort of moves to a higher gear and restarts the whole cycle again. And so putting images into this genesis is to sort of revivify them. So an image, just sort of treated as like some lines on a piece of paper or on a chalkboard or whatever, has no sort of intrinsic meaning or value. It's just a some ink embedded in some fibers, or some bits of chalk on a board or whatever. It's only when that set of marks is incorporated into practices of the way that they're used for say a geometrical demonstration, or to make up an artwork, or as part of a technical object, etc. It's only when these images are incorporated into something greater that they have meaning and value and contribute to the functioning of that greater whole. And so what we're doing when we do this phenomenology in Simondon's sense, which is quite different from like Husserlian phenomenology or Heideggerian or anything like that, is to make these images live again, whereas they sort of have a tendency to kind of fade away. Like you can think of this, for example, in the use of metaphor, where something might be introduced by a poet as a metaphor, and it has a sort of has a novelty and a power to evoke an image that hasn't been used before. But then, as it becomes sort of like an everyday phrase, people don't even think about what the image it evokes is anymore. So you can think of there's so many phrases in Shakespeare, for example, where he's the first person to, or recorded at least, to use these phrases. but then that have become like cliches in our everyday language now. So like at some point these were poetic creations that evoked an image or that had a symbolic meaning or something very powerful, but that gets sort of faded away over time and just becomes a cliche that people use without even thinking about the meaning. And so to sort of retrace the genesis or to perform this act of phenomenology or saving the phenomena means to sort of recapture that power that the image had in its initial creation, to sort of revivify the image in that sense. And so it's in this sense that Simondon describes it as revealing the desire of things to exist a second time by being born again in a meaningful universe. And so here we have this communication between the past and the present, and then through the present with the future. So you can look at an artwork from ancient Greece or a poem from ancient Greece or Shakespeare or whatever. It's obviously created in a very specific cultural context, which is very different from ours. But it through this act of creative reappropriation of the image, this phenomenology, we are able to connect or appropriate this artwork from a very different context and grasp it as something universal. So like we can read Homer, most of us in translation, not in the original, but we can read Homer and like if we think of sort of the cultural context in which these poems were produced, it was probably essentially like propaganda for particular rulers that showing their claim to legitimacy and their lineage and so on. But the value of this work for artistic or aesthetic enjoyment is much greater than like the particular purposes that it was created for. Yeah, you can make these images of the Homeric poem come to life again through tracing the genesis and situating them in connection with sort of the project of human life in general. And so in that sense, you make them universal. Yeah, I think the connection with Hegel here is an interesting one. So this is what Angus has put in the chat about connection with Hegel. So for Hegel, art, of course, is one of the elements of absolute spirit or domains of absolute spirit. So this is something where the distinction between subject and object is overcome in some sense. So there's a sort of unity of subject and object. So this is the case in art, religion, and philosophy, and primarily in philosophy, but also in religion and art. For Simondon, Simondon doesn't talk a lot about religion, or at least he doesn't have an explicit philosophy of religion the way that Hegel does. But the role of art, I think, maybe is similar in some sense because it's sort of prior to or it's not restricted to something subjective. So like we were talking a little bit before we started recording about Kant. For Kant, aesthetics has to do with a subjective factor of enjoyment of an artwork, but it has this sort of by describing something as beautiful, you make a claim to universality. You're not just saying this artwork produces pleasure in me, but you're saying that everyone should have pleasure in perceiving this artwork. And for Kant, this is a very sort of complicated and difficult logical problem of how to explain how like something very subjective in particular like pleasure can have this objective value in the artwork or this universalizability in the artwork. But for Simondon, I think the idea is that we're not starting from like a subjective enjoyment and then trying to figure out how do we universalize this. Instead, we're looking at the artwork as like the individuation, the genesis of an artwork. And the factor of subjective enjoyment is sometimes accessory to the creation of the artwork, like in the case of these opticalized objects that you just apply this high-vis tape to it or something, or like the Baroque type of thing with the application of flowers to a column. So yeah, the subjective enjoyment side is sort of secondary to the actual creation of an aesthetic object. And I think maybe this is why Simondon thinks surrealism is so important. Is that this factor of subjective enjoyment of taking pleasure in an artwork is kind of I don't want to say eliminated in surrealism, but at least it's not foregrounded in the same way as it is in prior artistic movements. So you're not necessarily expected to, experience pleasure in observing surrealist artwork. It might be actually quite disturbing. You can think of like Dali's stuff with like the film. I think I forget what it's called, but with like the razor blade in the eye, which is obviously not like pleasant to watch. So yeah, I think this kind of separation between pleasure and the artwork is maybe where the artwork for Simondon has this I don't know want to say absolute status like in Hegel, but like it's something that is not sort of limited to the subjective enjoyment of a person. Yeah, and so you can sort of fit it into the Kantian framework by saying, yeah, there's a purpose, there's something purposive about a surrealist artwork. It's not just a random, collection of colors on a canvas or random collection of words on a page, for example. So it has an intention or a goal directedness to it. But at the same time, you can't sort of say like this is the purpose of this artwork. It's sort of elusive. The purpose is elusive in that sense. So yeah, that does fit with the Kantian framework, but in a different way than his notion of the artwork as being related to pleasure. Yeah, and this is an interesting question. Is there always a purpose to an artwork? And there have been like I don't know this sort of tendency that well, but there have been people who have tried to use randomness in their artwork or mechanical methods that sort of to some extent at least eliminate purposiveness. So like you what's the name of the school? I can't remember. There's a group of poets in French poets who tried to use like sort of random generation methods. Yeah, I think it was Ulipo. Who like use sort of random generation methods of like picking words out of a box and creating poetry through sort of conjunctions of words selected randomly, as opposed to with a sort of intention of the poet to evoke an idea or an emotion or whatever. I guess this is a sort of method to try to eliminate purpose, but at the same time, there's like a purpose of eliminating the purpose, if that makes sense. Like the whole project of using this random method is itself set up by the artist as a goal, and like you see this with sort of contemporary art, where the object itself, the painting or sculpture or whatever it is always accompanied by an artist's statement of some kind that explains like, I created this object using this method of randomization, or this is sort of the concept behind this artwork. And so there's always like an accompaniment of explanation of the artwork. And so like the this artist statement sort of expresses a purpose in some sense, even if the purpose is to not have a purpose or something like that. So there, it's hard to avoid something like a purpose in general in the artwork, I think. Yeah, and 61 has pointed out that even a frame of a painting is already a kind of like quasi explanation. You're already sort of setting off the realm of the painting from the surrounding space. You're making a sort of boundary around the painting and saying this is the world of the painting that you sort of are supposed to separate from the rest of the world. And you have artists who do things like I forget who it is. There's the artist who cuts the canvas, like puts a slash in the canvas, which is again sort of separate. I don't know, disrupting this expectation of the canvas as like a closed space, so that you like the canvas is already sort of open to the rest of the world in a way that it normally isn't. So yeah, like you can sort of play with these conventions or like ideas, but you're always in some way expressing expressing some purpose or working in relation to some purpose, even if that purpose is something like not expressing a purpose. So yeah, it's very difficult to think of an artwork that wouldn't have any relation to purposiveness at all.
I can continue reading.
Yeah, that would be great. Yeah, since I cut you off after one paragraph.
I can read it. I'll just read about I can just read at the end of this section.
Yeah, sure.
There's a logical relation between the three types of formalization of an object, so that the same object can, over time or by migrating from one culture to another, change category: sacredness, technicity, art. Contemporary cargo airplanes are revered by the indigenous people of Port Moresby, quote-unquote cargo cult, who built landing strips and a perfunctory control tower in their villages to invite the planes to land. Such a category shift is possible because they attribute the creation of the planes to their ancestors and consider whites as mere thieves and the current holders, but not the true builders of the planes. The passage from technicity to the sacred without any modification of the object is made possible by pushing the origin of the object into the past, not a historical past, but the absolute past of original, ancestral, and mythical sources. The category of the sacred is that of the absolute and original past, that is, implying and bearing the present existence of the individual and collective subject. The paternal abode or the domain of the ancestors, as an object constructed and organized by primordial beings with respect to our existence, is clothed with sacredness. Conversely, the aesthetic object is entirely coherent with respect to itself, only within a perspective whose vanishing point lies in an indeterminate future. The sacred eludes any causality that is historically assignable by going towards the indefiniteness of the past, in the same manner that the true aesthetic essence eludes any assignable finality by going towards the indefiniteness of the future. The sacred is beyond causality, and the aesthetic is beyond the functional. However, within the technical object that is of the present, the close interaction of the causal and the functional produces the greatest possible proximity between the created object and natural reality, both of which diverge within the sacred and aesthetic categories. Technical invention is perfected by the inner resonance of the produced object, that is to say, by the situation in which each subset modulates all the others. A naive invention, quote-unquote naive invention, orders its different subsets according to a finality and in a unidirectional manner in order to reach a result. The various subsets thus act as recruited and situated accessories. Finality thereby remains provisionally superior to the relays of causality that are subjected to it. But perfecting consists in elevating the level of intrinsic compatibility by tightening the linkage between subsets, which amounts to bestowing on each of them a power to modulate the structure of the others, as in an organism according to a process of individuation. It would be possible to study the conditions that facilitate invention among individuals and groups. A rather large number of techniques for facilitating invention or for increasing the level of creativity have been presented, for instance, in Osborne's quote-unquote brainstorming. Such techniques are often stated in the form of negative rules, the rejection of prejudice, customs, hierarchic relations, of systematic and critical attitudes, the quote, think up or shut up, unquote, of Osborne. Positive rules are fuzzier, try inverting solutions that already exist, attempt to suppress one element, etc. In truth, the spirit of these methods, beyond their general aspect of opening a field of research, tends to eliminate the modes of mental activity producing strictly univocal representations, such as systematic deduction, to make room for the genesis in the form of images of complex and non-univocal representations through transposition, inversion, or change of scale. Technical invention can therefore serve as a paradigm for processes of creation that take place in other domains. More generally, problem resolution in groups is fostered by everything that increases the polyvocality of representations and the plurality of attitudes in each member of the group. Role change is one of the means for progressively substituting a structure of hierarchizing finality with a state of inner resonance in the group. The group becomes an organism to the extent that each member modulates the others. It is then that a group becomes capable of creation rather than remaining a hierarchized system of execution. There is a possible linkage between creativity within the group and the inventive attitude in the individual. The Socratic dialectic is one of the most illustrious examples of it. The group discovers meanings and succeeds in solving a problem by inventing itself as an organism. The concrete distribution of doctrines, of attitudes, and of specialties across members of the group gives, in a way, living substrate to representations. Each state of the relations between members materializes an attempt to combine principles. A group organizes itself to the extent that, through its exchanges, each of the members modulates all the others. This kind of dense point about the temporality of the sacred and the work of art and the technical object is interesting. I'm not sure what he means by this idea that the aesthetic object has a vanishing point that lies in an indeterminate future. Maybe this is kind of what we've been talking about with the Kantian point about the inability to subordinate the work of art to a concept, or we were talking about in the chat, the surrealist work of art that doesn't have a resolution for the problem that it poses and sort of indefinitely defers it, would be one way, I guess, of thinking of this, the future-oriented aspect of the work of art. And then I guess the point about the sacred is just that it's, because its causality is so absolutely past, it's inexplicable. It's just causality is like indefinitely remote, so that the origin of the sacred itself can't be explained.
Yeah, I think this idea of the indefinite vanishing point of the aesthetic object in this indeterminate future, I think this has to do with the way that an aesthetic object can always be sort of reappropriated in the future. So, like what I was talking about earlier about how the Homeric poems, for example, are produced in one very specific cultural context, but they can be appreciated in a completely different cultural context thousands of years later, and they can be used as like a source. Like we find Shakespeare, I don't think he ever uses Homeric poems, but like he uses sort of ancient Greek sources or medieval sources, and then he completely sort of reinvents those sources and produces something completely new in a very different cultural context. So an artwork that has true aesthetic value is something that can always be reappropriated or reinvented in indefinitely many ways in the future. It's never, you can never sort of exhaust the meaning and say, okay, now we've like fully sort of, you know, mined all the possibilities of the Homeric poems, and now they're like, you know, completely exhibited in, you know, all the artistic creations that have been produced since then. There's always going to be more you can do with those poems, or new things you can invent on the basis of those poems. So yeah, I think that's the sense in which an aesthetic object has this indefinite future orientation to it. And then, yeah, this is sort of like the counterpart to the sacred object, which has this indefinite orientation towards the past, where the realm of ancestors, or sort of the origin of the world, or something like that, is this past before every historical past. So like, it's not just that, you know, this realm is like, you know, a certain number of generations ago, or like a determinate distance in time in the past, but it's like a past before every historically determinable past. So yeah, it's this indefinite past that is prior to every determinate past, and it's prior to causality, or beyond causality, in the sense that the relationship between this indeterminate past and the present is not one that you can understand in terms of how one set of events brings about the other. It's like in history, as a sequence of events, you can say how, you know, this event caused this other event, or made it more likely, or something like that. But this sort of sacred realm prior to history doesn't have that relationship of causality with history. You can't say that the sacred realm sort of brings about events in history. And then in the case of the technical object, these two, these sort of future and past orientations coincide in the sense that causality and finality are linked together. So you have again, this is what he goes through in a very condensed form in that paragraph. But he talks about the way that he talks about this process of concretization of a technical object. So in an abstract technical object, you have one the whole object is sort of subordinated to an external goal. You have a goal of producing a certain type of effect, and then you put components together in such a way that each component contributes one sort of element to that effect. But then, as the technical object becomes more and more concrete, the subordination to that finality is less and less important, and then the functioning of the technical object becomes more and more integrated and more like a living organism, where every element of the organism has a plurifunctional role, and they all sort of interact with each other rather than being all subordinated to a sort of external goal. So like a plant or an animal or any living organism doesn't have a sort of finality in the sense of an external goal, but it has a sort of internal finality in the sense that it produces its own existence. It continually makes itself continue to exist by appropriating energy and nutrients and so on from the environment. So yeah, this is and technical objects. He in the book on the mode of existence of technical objects, he says that technical objects can never fully reach this level of integration of a living organism, but they continually approach that level as they become more and more concrete. And then we have this bit about techniques of invention, and I put this in the chat. There's a slight translation, maybe not error, but issue, I would say, that they translate it as techniques of invention, and I think that's probably not a good translation. I think techniques is better, but in French it's the same word. So he's talking about like these sort of creativity in eliciting exercises that like you sometimes, I don't know if anyone's experienced this at work, where you have like these sort of sessions where you're supposed to like come up with ideas and these exercises to make people more creative. They're usually pretty boring, and I don't think they're very successful. But yeah, exactly. Yeah, so they're just sort of like exercises that you do like for the purpose of checking off a box more than anything else. But here Simondon is looking at like to what extent is something like a technique of creativity possible, because there's a certain contradictory element to this idea, right? Because creativity is something that is productive of novelty or of something that doesn't already exist. But insofar as you have like a technique or a set of rules to follow for like how to be creative, you're already not being creative, right? You're like following some rules that are already given. And so he points out that the sort of negative rules are more effective than or more specific than the positive rules. Like, so things like in this idea of brainstorming as a sort of exercise of creativity. So one of the important negative rules is to not reject ideas at the outset. So you just sort of throw ideas on the wall, and eventually, like, it's only later after you have a bunch of ideas that you actually do a sort of triage and figure out like which of these ideas is actually useful or workable or whatever. And so this sort of absence of a censorship of your ideas is important in sort of allowing these ideas that in a more restrained exercise you might not actually put forward, but here in this sort of formal brainstorming session, you put forward every idea and you don't actually criticize or reject ideas until later on. But then when he talks about some of the like positive rules that you can suggest for brainstorming, he says these are like not really that useful. So things like take an existing object or process or whatever, and then try removing one of the elements and see what results. So this is like, not that specific. Like it doesn't really tell you what to do. And I think in general, if you try doing this with like, say, a technical object, if you try removing one element of the technical object, most of the time it's just going to produce a broken technical object. It's not going to produce anything useful. so yeah, this positive rule is not like that helpful most of the time. But yeah, it's there's I think what Simon sees as like the core sort of valuable product of these sort of brainstorming exercises is not so much like that it would be sort of a way of boosting your creativity by 17% or whatever, that like these kinds of seminars advertise themselves as doing. But it's the idea of producing a different kind of image. So instead of these univocal images, so like images that have one determinate meaning or one determinate purpose or something like that, instead you produce these polyvocal images. So again, this is related to this point of concretization. So the images, instead of having just one function or one meaning, they have multiple functions and multiple meanings. And so this allows for them to be sort of rearranged and put together in different ways that maybe were not foreseen when the images were first produced. And so like in terms of a creative process, something like producing a musical work, for example, sometimes you can like say take a melody and play it backwards and see, does that produce something interesting or valuable? Or you can like take parts like in sampling, for example, you take an existing musical work and you sort of chop it up into bits and rearrange those bits and produce a new musical work that has a completely different aesthetic value. So you're these kinds of musical images have more than a purely than a strictly univocal function. They have this polyvocal function that allows them to be rearranged and connected in different ways and produce new effects. And then this last bit in this section, he very briefly talks about the relationship between groups and creativity. And we can connect this also with individuation, where he talks about collective individuation and this notion of the trans-individual. So this is something that is not, strictly speaking, confined to one individual person as an already individuated being, and it's also not just something that belongs to a group of people in the sense of multiple already individuated beings. It's something that is brought about through the actual process of individuation of a group, of a collective. So it's insofar as the collective forms something like an individual, that it has this relationship to the trans-individual element of reality. And this is closely connected with creativity, because a group is only the group only is an individual insofar as it creates something new. The formation of the group is a kind of invention, as opposed to, say, the formation or I guess you can say the recruitment of individuals into something like an existing structure that already has rules for people. So, for example, when you get hired by a company, or you you enroll as a student at a school or something like that, you already have these assigned roles in this institution of, this is what my job is, this is what my functions as a student at this institution are, etc. This is not an instance of collective individuation. But when you maybe something like an artistic collective, for example, you don't necessarily know what your role is in this group. You have to sort of collectively figure out how you're going to work together. What are the rules and structures that you need to make that interaction work with each other. So just by virtue of forming that collective, you are inventing something new. Yeah, and yeah, you're right. This is the new is something hard to get to. So for Simondon, this collective individuation, or even at the level of the individual, is never something that's sort of given to us easily. It's something that we have to go through a process, and it requires work and yeah, like a sort of experimentation to bring it about. It's not something you can just say, I'm going to be creative today or something. And anyone who's like tried to write creative writing or even nonfiction writing, if you just sort of sit down and say, I'm going to create something today, it often doesn't really work. You just have to sort of plug away and only after a hard process of pushing through writer's block or multiple drafts that you maybe end up throwing out and restarting, etc. It's only after all this work that you sort of realized, yeah, I actually have created something new. This is something that didn't exist before I actually started this process. Okay, so let's go on to the conclusion. Yeah, we may not get through it today, but that's fine. Would either of you, aside from Angus, would you like to read, or should I read?
I can read a little bit.
Sure. Yeah, so let's go through. I don't think there. Oh, yeah, there are some headings in the conclusion. So maybe just read up to, like, from the start to the next heading on the next page.
Okay, so conclusion, recapitulation. The first 3 parts of this course study the genesis of the image across the stages of a direct cycle of growth, development, and saturation of a sub-individual component of the mental activity under consideration, more or less like an organism or an organ within a larger organism. The last part sought to show how, when the saturation point of that component is reached, a saturation point that depends on the capacities of each living being to organize information, there is, in the course of a critical process globally designated as invention when its results are positive, a change of structure, which is also a change in order of magnitude through the implementation of a reciprocity between the sub-individual elements, images in a state of symbol, and the directing lines of a superset, which, during the 3 preceding stages, did not exist in a state of actuality, but only in the form of constraints, limits, or sources of information that are outside the living being. This means that invention, induced by a need for internal compatibility, occurs through and is expressed in the position of an organized system that includes the living being through which it emerges as a subset. Formally comparable to a change of milieu, the wish to find a new milieu is in fact one substitute for failed invention. Invention is distinguished from the images preceding it by the fact that it performs a change in the order of magnitude. It does not stay within the living being as a component of its mental equipment, but steps over the spatio-temporal limits of the living to connect with the milieu which it organizes. The tendency to transcend the individual subject, which is actualized through invention, is in fact contained virtually in the 3 previous stages of the image cycle. The amplifying projection of the motor tendency, prior to the experience of the object, is an implicit hypothesis of the deployment within the world. The perceptual classes, serving as a subjective system for the reception of incident information, posits a universal application. And finally, the symbolic bond of memory images, while it expresses the attachment of the subject to the situations that constituted its history in a centripetal direction, it also and above all prepares for the use of reversibility, which converts this bond into a pathway towards things. In none of the 3 stages of its genesis is the mental image limited by the individual subject who carries it. It is this relative exteriority that is realized in invention by the position of created objects serving as organizers of the milieu. A created object is not a materialized image, nor is it placed arbitrarily in the world like an object among other objects in order to overload nature with an artificial supplement. It is, through its origin and remains, through its function, a linkage system between the living and its milieu, a double point in which the subjective world and the objective world communicate. Among social species, this point is triple, since it becomes a pathway of relations between individuals, organizing their reciprocal functions. In this case, the triple point is also a social organizer. For all these reasons, the system of created objects within the double perspective of the relation with nature, which tends through the working of this system to become the organized superset of compatible territories, and of the relation with the social as a superset of functions that may be organized as synergy, constitutes the envelope of the individual.
Thanks. Yeah, this bit is somewhat dense, but he's definitely making references back to the book Individuation. This notion of or this sort of paradigm example of the crystal that he works with throughout that book. So again, we have this supersaturated solution, and then we have the germ crystal that enters into this solution or is formed through random fluctuations. And then we have the crystallization that proceeds around the limits of the germ crystal. So the solution gradually crystallizes from one layer to the next. And this is his sort of model for individuation in general, of course, applied in very different forms in different domains. So here, when he's talking about the image, we have this process through which the image becomes saturated. So the image passes from sort of an anticipation of. These are sort of the categories in which we expect to find things. So we have these concepts of what a dog looks like, what a cat looks like, etc. And then we classify the images of the entities that we see in the world or perceive in the world. We classify them under these categories. We assign, this object in front of me is, fits the image of a dog, for example. These are sort of very basic types of images. But then we have this whole cycle of the image that we've gone throughout this book, where the image becomes saturated, and so it takes on this symbolic function. So these are things like in the chapter we read on symbols. He talks about how the flag, for example, in terms of like materiality, is just a piece of cloth with like some colors on it, but it can have all sorts of affective resonances and importance for people who actually die to protect a flag on the battlefield, for example. So yeah, these objects, when they become symbols or when the image becomes a symbol, it takes on this sort of saturated character that has this power that sort of goes beyond itself. And invention here is a change in order of magnitude in the same way that we saw in individuation. There's this in the book Individuation, the process of individuation involves a linkage or connecting different orders of magnitude. So his example that I think is the sort of key example for this is the way that a plant integrates or makes a connection between like a molecular level of order of magnitude. So all the different nutrients that are in the soil, for example, and then a sort of cosmic level by absorbing energy from the sun. And then produces the plant as an organism, which is an intermediate level of order of magnitude. This is sort of like this kind of bridging orders of magnitude process is part of what Simondon sees the whole process of individuation as involving. And so again, in the invention of a technical object, for example, you are like bridging between or passing from one order of magnitude to another, where you have these saturated images that have this symbolic function, and then you move to a higher order of magnitude and then restart the whole cycle of the image again. And then so Simondon takes this like whole cycle of the image to show that the image is not something restricted to the individual subject. So obviously there only are images insofar as there are entities that treat things like images, or that have a sort of imaging function in them. So primarily animals, and then human beings as specific types of animals. But at the same time, the image is not reducible to something within the subject, because there's always this relation to something outside the subject that is part of what makes something into an image. And then he points out that so the image connects the living being with its milieu, with the environment in which it lives. It's something that points beyond the living being into the rest of the world. And then also in social organisms like human beings, it connects one individual with another. So like he talks about in earlier parts of the book how we can sort of externalize our thoughts, something that might be in some respect is confined to our own mind, by making it something symbolic, something that is realized in an object outside of my mind. It becomes something that someone else can take up, and then they can understand what I thought or experienced or felt or whatever, and then they can transform those symbols and create something new with those symbols. the externalization of an image into an object, whether it's an artistic production or a technical object or whatever, this externalization allows that object that is playing the role of an image to link between me and some other person that they might not even know who I am. They might find my artwork thousands of years after my death and put it in a museum or study it in terms of its artistic value and so on. But so my creation is something that is independent of me, that exists in the world, and someone else can pick it up and do other things with it. Okay, let's go on to the molecular. So you're talking about when I mentioned the bit about the plant, the molecular level, and I think so. In the case of the plant, it's more concrete because we can actually think of like actual physical molecules that the plant absorbs from the soil and things like that. It's a bit more sort of abstract at the level when we're talking about images, because of course the images are not like physically bumping into each other or moving around. It's a kind of individuation of images in like a space of images, if we want to put it that way. So we have to sort of picture the realm of images as like almost this, like he says here, the images or the created objects that result from the images are a kind of envelope of the individual. So we can think of like an animal, including a human being, as sort of surrounded by this like world of images that sort of envelops that individual organism, but extends beyond the organism into the rest of the world as well. Yeah,
sorry. Good.
I was just going to respond to this comment in the chat about this collective unconscious, and this is a concept that's associated with Jung. And Simondon has, in a couple of places, expressed some sympathy for Jung's work. I think for him, the one thing that he sort of criticizes, or where he separates himself from Jung, is that he doesn't think that collective, whatever we want to describe as like a collective realm of the unconscious, can't be made up of sort of already constituted concepts or already constituted images. So like Jung talks about like these archetypes, and then you have people, what's his name? The guy, the thousand faces of the hero or whatever. I forget his name now, but anyway, he's like following Jung. Joseph Campbell, that's one, and George Lucas, sort of modeled Star Wars on his account of narrative. So there's like this idea that there's like this already constituted structure of this collective unconscious, and for Simondon, there can't be preformationism for the symbolic realm. There can't be like these already constituted myths or this already constituted figures of like the hero or whatever. So these, whatever we want to think of as this sort of equivalent of the collective unconscious, whatever exactly Simondon would describe it as, it's something that is prior to individuation. It's something out of which we individuate symbols and stories and so on. So it's not something that is already constituted. It's like a sort of reservoir out of which we constitute things like stories.
This reference to the third term, the triple point, as a social organizer. I was just reading one of Bruce Fink's books on Lacan, and so I have this real symbolic imaginary division in mind. But it seems like, and Simondon did mention Lacan earlier in the book, also I think with reference to the symbolic, when he was talking about Sartre and this dyadic versus triadic distinction between the two thinkers. But I wonder if Simondon has Lacan in mind, or something similar to the Lacanian symbolic as that which structures I understand the imaginary as just like the empirical world that we kind of consciously inhabit. And it also makes me wish that Simondon, I know he doesn't talk that much about language and individuation. I wonder if he would see it as an invention, or I don't know. I guess I just wonder how language would fit into this whether it would be an invention or something that sort of pre-exists and facilitates invention, or kind of a mixture between the two?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I know some of the secondary literature. I can't remember who exactly, but someone has pointed out that language is sort of like the big missing piece in Simondon, that he almost never talks about, like what role language plays in human existence or mental life or anything like that. Um, and I think in relation to Lacan, I think like Simondon is in a lot of ways sort of an anti-structuralist, or like he's almost like it's not always. I mean, he's not like a polemic author. He doesn't like sort of set up someone else and say this person is wrong and here's why I'm different than this person. He just sort of does his own thing. But I think this idea that there's like a sort of pre-existing structure in which we have to like the idea that subjectivity, for example, is like structured by this symbolic level of language. I think Simondon would see that as too sort of restrictive, and not accounting for the creativity of the subject. That, of course, as a subject, as a human being, we exist within a particular time and place and social context and so on, and we always only exist within that sort of context and determination. But at the same time, we're not sort of bound to only sort of play a role within like a sort of pre-existing role within a set of functions that is assigned by a structure. So for Simondon, like there's always this creativity that is allowed to take an existing structure, take an existing institution, and then sort of reinvent it. So yeah, it's a more subtle, I think, and ambiguous relationship to this notion of like to what extent is human existence or mental life in particular determined by something outside of the individual subject. And for Simondon, of course, we like as we've been talking about, there's always these images always point beyond the subject. So we don't have like a sort of self-contained subjectivity that pulls itself up by its bootstraps or something like that. There's this sort of reciprocal relation between the world and the subject, but at the same time, there's this creativity that is never fully reducible to the already existing structures of the world, that I think Simondon would see as sort of lacking in more structuralist accounts of subjectivity. But yeah, I'm a bit hesitant to sort of say exactly what the relationship is between Simondon and Lacan, because I only know Lacan's work very superficially, and he's obviously like one of the most obscure writers of all time. So like, pinning down what exactly he's asserting in any given text is quite difficult. So yeah, it's I don't want to be too definitive in saying that Lacan is a sort of structuralist in the sense that I'm presenting Simondon as being opposed to. Okay, let's go on to the next bit. I wonder, we may just be able to finish this passage. Actually, yeah, that might be a good idea. What does everyone think? Do we want to push through and see if we can finish, or do we want to save this last section for next time, which would be probably a short session?
I would vote for saving it for next time. Yeah, to give it more time as well.
Yeah, that's probably a good idea. Yeah, we have no fixed schedule. We don't need to rush through it. So yeah, let's stop here. We'll finish it next time. There's some interesting. Yeah, there's a couple. Like he gives some references. He talks about Bogdanov, which is pretty interesting because he was. We'll talk about that next time. But yeah, it's a pretty interesting thing for him to refer to because it was definitely not like top of mind in 1950s or 1960s France when he's writing this. So yeah, that's something we can talk about next time, and we'll finish the book, and then we can talk a little bit about what we want to do next. We've discussed that a bit, but we can make a final determination next week.
That sounds great.
Okay, so thanks everyone for coming out. Thanks for your contributions. and we'll finish up next time and then talk about what we want to do next. So hope to see you all there.